The neon-lit streets of downtown blurred past as I pedaled harder, the chill night air biting at my exposed fingers. I should have worn gloves, but the weather app lied again. Story of my life. As I weaved through the sea of yellow taxis and impatient drivers, my phone buzzed. Another order. Great, because rent wasn't going to pay itself. I'm Alex, your average food delivery cyclist in this concrete jungle. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills, mostly. Tonight started like any other, a steady stream of burger joints and pizza places. But then came the order that would change everything. The address popped up on my screen, 1255 Elm Street. Never delivered there before. It was a bit out of my usual zone, but the tip looked promising. I adjusted my route and set off, the city's heartbeat pulsing around me. The brownstone loomed ahead, its windows dark except for a faint glow on the top floor. I locked up my bike and climbed the steps, container in hand. A woman answered, mid-40s maybe, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, thank you so much," she said, taking the bag. "You cyclists are lifesavers." Something about her tone made me uneasy, but I brushed it off, probably just tired. I gave my usual enjoy your meal spiel and headed back into the night. 2 days later, another order came through. Different restaurant, but the same name, Sarah Johnson. This time, the address was an apartment complex on the outskirts of town. Weird coincidence, I thought, but people move all the time. The building was run down, graffiti scarring its walls. I found the right door and knocked. The same woman answered, this time in a bathrobe. "You again!" she exclaimed. "What are the odds?" I forced a smile. "Small world, I guess. Here's your order." As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse inside. The apartment was bare, just a mattress on the floor and some boxes. She must have just moved in, I reasoned. Still, something felt off. A week passed, filled with the usual monotony of deliveries and near misses with car doors. Then, like clockwork, another order from Sarah Johnson. This time it was a house in the suburbs, a good 45-minute ride from my usual area. I almost declined it, but the tip was too good to pass up. As I pedaled through increasingly quiet streets, streetlights growing farther apart, a knot formed in my stomach. This was the third time I delivered to this woman, each time at a completely different location. Who moves that much? The house was set back from the road, partially hidden by overgrown hedges. I propped my bike against a tree and approached the porch, the wooden steps creaking under my feet. Before I could knock, the door swung open. "You made it," Sarah said, her smile wider than ever. "Please, come in for a moment. I'd love to give you a proper tip for coming all this way." Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but my feet seemed to move on their own. The house was sparsely furnished, like the apartment had been. Sarah disappeared into the kitchen, leaving me alone in the dim living room. My eyes darted around, taking in details. No photos on the walls, no personal touches. It was as if no one really lived here. A chill ran down my spine. "Here we are," Sarah's voice made me jump. She handed me a crisp bill way more than the usual tip. "For your trouble." As I pocketed the money, movement caught my eye. A shadow passed by a doorway deeper in the house. We weren't alone. "I should go," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "Other deliveries waiting." Sarah's expression changed just for a second. Something cold and calculating flashed in her eyes before the pleasant mask slipped back into place. "Of course, dear, thank you again." I practically ran to my bike, pedaling away as fast as my legs would carry me. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out the quiet of the suburban night. What the hell was going on? The next day, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I kept replaying the encounters in my mind, trying to make sense of it all. 3 different locations in less than 2 weeks. The empty homes, the shadow in the hallway. None of it added up. I decided to do some digging. A quick search for Sarah Johnson turned up thousands of results, but nothing that seemed connected to the woman I'd met. I tried the addresses, but came up empty there too. It was as if she didn't exist. My phone buzzed. Another order. My blood ran cold as I saw the name, Sarah Johnson. This time, the address was an old warehouse on the river, miles from anywhere I'd delivered before. Every rational part of my brain screamed to ignore it, to call the police, to do anything but accept. But curiosity and a morbid sense of needing answers won out. I hit accept before I could change my mind. The ride to the warehouse district was tense. Every car that passed too close, every shadow in an alleyway set my nerves on edge. The sun was setting by the time I arrived, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The warehouse loomed before me, its windows dark and uninviting. No signs of life, no cars parked outside, just silence and the distant lapping of the river. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart, and approached the entrance. A note was taped to the door. "Come in, delivery around back." Every horror movie I'd ever seen flashed through my mind. This was how people disappeared, never to be seen again. But I'd come this far. I had to know what was going on. I crept around the side of the building, my footsteps echoing in the eerie quiet. A loading dock came into view, its large metal door slightly ajar. Light spilled out from inside, along with the murmur of voices. Gathering every ounce of courage I had, I called out, "Hello, delivery?" The voices stopped, footsteps approached. I tensed, ready to run if needed. The door rolled up, revealing Sarah and 3 men I'd never seen before. "You made it," Sarah beamed, but there was no warmth in her eyes. We were starting to worry. I held out the bag of food, my hand trembling slightly. "Here's your order. I'll just be going now." One of the men stepped forward, blocking my exit. "Not so fast, kid. Why don't you join us for a bit?" My heart hammered against my ribs. "I really can't. Other deliveries waiting. You know how it is." Sarah's facade dropped completely, her expression hardening. "Cut the act. We know you've been poking around, asking questions. That's not very smart." Realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This was never about food delivery. I'd stumbled into something much bigger, much more dangerous. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know what's going on here, and I don't want to. I'll forget everything. Just let me go." The men exchanged glances. One of them, a burly guy with a scar across his cheek, spoke up. "Can't do that, I'm afraid. You've seen too much." I backed away slowly, but they advanced. My mind raced, searching for a way out. In a desperate move, I hurled the food bag at the nearest man and bolted. I heard shouts behind me as I sprinted around the warehouse. My bike was just ahead, my ticket to freedom. I jumped on and pedaled harder than I ever had in my life. The sound of an engine roaring to life spurred me on. They were coming after me. I cut through alleys and side streets, using every shortcut I knew from months of deliveries. My lungs burned, legs screaming in protest, but I didn't dare slow down. I don't know how long I rode, constantly checking over my shoulder for headlights. Eventually, I found myself in a busy part of downtown. I ditched my bike in a crowded plaza and lost myself in the sea of pedestrians. Hours later, exhausted and still shaking, I sat in a 24-hour diner nursing a cup of coffee. My phone lay on the table, dark and silent. I'd turned off all the location services and removed the battery for good measure. What had I gotten myself into? Drug trafficking, money laundering? Whatever it was clear these people were dangerous, and they knew who I was. As the adrenaline wore off, the reality of my situation sank in. I couldn't go home. I couldn't go back to work. Hell, I couldn't even be sure the police would believe me or be able to help. The waitress refilled my cup, giving me a concerned look. "You okay, hon? You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a weak smile. Long night. As she walked away, I stared into the black depths of my coffee, seeing my own reflection. The face looking back at me was a stranger, wide-eyed, pale, forever changed by the events of the night. I had no idea what tomorrow would bring or how I was going to get out of this mess. But one thing was certain. My days as a simple food delivery cyclist were over. Now I was running for my life, carrying a secret I never asked for and desperate for a way out. The neon, "Open 24 hours" sign flickered in the window, casting a red glow across the table. I took another sip of coffee and began to plan my next move. Whatever happened, I knew one thing for sure. I'd never look at a food delivery app the same way again. Story 2. The headlights in my rearview mirror were so close, they might as well have been in the back seat. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white as I tried to focus on the road ahead. But those piercing beams demanded my attention, a constant, unnerving presence that had been shadowing me for the last 20 miles. It started as an ordinary drive home from my late shift at the diner. The clock on my dashboard read 1:37 a.m. as I merged onto the highway. The familiar hum of my old Honda Civic, a comforting sound in the quiet night. The road stretched out before me, empty save for a few scattered truckers making their overnight hauls. I first noticed the car about 10 minutes into my drive. A dark sedan, its make and model obscured by the night, pulled onto the highway behind me. Nothing unusual about that, I thought. But as the miles ticked by, I realized it was matching my every move. When I changed lanes to pass a slow-moving semi, the sedan followed. When I took the exit for a more scenic route home, a winding road that cut through dense forest, it was right there with me. At first I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were just heading in the same direction. Maybe it was a coincidence, but the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. I pressed down on the accelerator, pushing my old car faster than I normally would on these twisting roads. The trees on either side became a dark blur as I sped up, hoping to put some distance between us. For a moment I thought it had worked. The headlights in my mirror seemed to shrink, falling back. My relief was short-lived. Within seconds, the car surged forward, closing the gap between us in an instant. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched it draw near, so close now that I couldn't see its license plate, just those blinding headlights. I tried to remember the safety tips I'd heard over the years. Don't drive home, go to a police station. But out here, miles from town, those weren't options. My hand shook as I reached for my phone, cursing under my breath as I saw the no service indicator mocking me from the screen. A sign for an upcoming gas station offered a glimmer of hope. It was one of those 24-hour places, not much more than a couple of pumps and a small convenience store, but it would have people. Light. Safety. I flicked on my turn signal, my body tense as I waited to see if the car behind me would do the same. It didn't. For a moment I allowed myself to hope that this might be the end of it, that whoever was behind me would continue on their way, and this would become nothing more than a scary story to tell my friends tomorrow. I began to slow down as I approached the exit for the gas station. That's when I heard it, the roar of an engine gunning behind me. I glanced in my rearview mirror just in time to see the sedan accelerating, barreling towards me with alarming speed. My body reacted before my mind could process what was happening. I slammed on the accelerator, gripping the wheel with both hands as my car shot forward. The sudden burst of speed pushed me back into my seat as I blew past the gas station exit. The adrenaline coursing through my veins sharpened my senses. Every detail seemed heightened. The rough texture of the steering wheel under my sweaty palms, the slight shake of the car as I pushed it to its limits, the ominous growl of the engine behind me. My mind raced, trying to form a plan. I knew these roads well, having driven them countless times. Up ahead, there was a sharp turn followed by a straight stretch. If I could just make it around that bend, maybe I could find somewhere to turn off, to hide. I took the corner faster than I ever had before, my tires squealing in protest. For a split second, I thought I might lose control, but somehow, I managed to keep the car on the road. As soon as I straightened out, I killed my headlights, plunging the road ahead into darkness. It was risky, driving without lights, but I hoped it might buy me a few precious seconds of confusion from my pursuer. My eyes strained to make out the path ahead, relying on the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. I spotted a narrow dirt road branching off to the right, an old logging trail I'd noticed but never explored. Without hesitation, I yanked the wheel, my car bouncing roughly as it left the pavement for the uneven dirt path. Trees pressed in on both sides as I drove deeper into the forest, branches scraping against my car. I cut the engine but let the car continue to roll forward, holding my breath as I listened for any sign of pursuit. For a long moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart and the soft crunch of gravel under my slowly rolling tires. Then in the distance, the sound of an engine revving, growing fainter. They'd driven past my hiding spot. I let out a shaky breath, slumping forward to rest my forehead on the steering wheel. The adrenaline that had been keeping me sharp began to ebb, leaving me feeling drained and jittery. What now? I couldn't stay here all night, but the thought of getting back on the road filled me with dread. What if they were still out there, waiting? What if they came back? I don't know how long I sat there, every snapping twig or rustle of leaves making me flinch. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to stretch and warp, my fear distorting my perception. Eventually, the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky. The forest around me, which had seemed so menacing in the dark, slowly came into focus. Birds began their morning songs, the normal sounds of the awakening woods replacing the eerie silence of the night. With trembling hands, I turned the key in the ignition. The familiar rumble of my car's engine was oddly comforting. Slowly, cautiously, I backed out onto the main road, my eyes darting back and forth, searching for any sign of the sedan. The highway was empty, peaceful in the early morning light. No dark car lying in wait, no menacing headlights in my rearview mirror, just me and the open road. As I drove home, my mind kept replaying the events of the night. Who was in that car? What did they want? The questions swirled in my head, unanswered and unsettling. I pulled into my driveway, relief washing over me at the sight of my small house. I'd never been so glad to see its peeling paint and overgrown lawn. Home, safe. As I got out of the car on shaky legs, something caught my eye. There, stuck under my windshield wiper, was a small white card. My blood ran cold as I plucked it from the glass with trembling fingers. In neat printed letters it read, "Better luck next time." I spun around, my eyes frantically scanning the quiet street, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. No strange cars, no watching eyes, just the normal sights and sounds of my neighborhood waking up. I rushed inside, locking the door behind me. My hands shook as I dialed 911, the card clutched tightly in my fist. As I waited for the operator to pick up, my mind raced. How had they found my home? How long had they been watching me? The rest of the day passed in a blur of police reports and unanswered questions. The officers were sympathetic but ultimately helpless. Without a license plate number or a clear description of the car or driver, there wasn't much they could do. They advised me to be vigilant, to vary my routes home, to tell friends and family about my schedule. All the things you're supposed to do to stay safe. But as I sat in my living room that night, jumping at every sound, I knew things had changed. The world outside my windows suddenly seemed darker, more threatening. Every passing car made me tense up, wondering if this was the one, if they had come back to finish whatever game they had started. Sleep eluded me that night and many nights after. Even when exhaustion finally pulled me under, my dreams were filled with endless dark roads and pursuing headlights, always just a little too close. In the weeks that followed, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, checking my rearview mirror for cars that lingered too long behind me. I changed my shifts at the diner, bought a new car, even thought about moving. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. The card on my windshield had made that clear. Wherever I went, whatever I did, the memory of that night would follow me. The fear had burrowed its way into my mind, a constant, unwelcome passenger. Every time I get behind the wheel now, especially at night, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there they're waiting, watching, ready to resume the chase at any moment. And the worst part, I'll never know why. Was it a twisted game, a case of mistaken identity, or something more sinister? The not knowing is almost worse than the fear itself. So I drive on, always watching, always waiting, because out there on the dark roads anything can happen. And sometimes the headlights behind you are carrying more than just light. They're carrying terror. Story 3. Here's the full story for idea number 3, written in first person with approximately 1,500 words. The stench hit me first, as it always does, but this time something was different. Something was wrong. I've been working the night shift on garbage trucks for over a decade now, and I've seen and smelled just about everything you can imagine. But nothing could have prepared me for what I found that night. It was a Tuesday in late October, just past 2 a.m. The air had that crisp autumn chill that makes you grateful for a warm jacket and a hot thermos of coffee. I was working my usual route through the industrial district, an area full of warehouses, small factories, and office buildings that were all shuttered for the night. I pulled up to the next stop on my route, a nondescript office building with a row of dumpsters lined up against its back wall. As I maneuvered the truck into position, I noticed something odd. One of the dumpsters was slightly ajar, its lid propped open by what looked like a piece of cardboard. Probably just some kids messing around, I muttered to myself, climbing down from the cab. I approached the dumpster, my boots crunching on the loose gravel of the parking lot. The sound seemed amplified in the quiet of the night, making me oddly self-conscious. As I got closer, that nagging feeling that something was off grew stronger. The cardboard wasn't just propping the lid open, it was wedged in there deliberately, as if someone wanted to make sure the lid wouldn't close completely. I reached out to remove it, and that's when I noticed the smear of something dark on its edge. My heart rate picked up as I realized what I was looking at. Blood. Not a lot, but enough to be unmistakable. I should have walked away right then. Should have climbed back into my truck and called it in. But curiosity got the better of me. I've always been like that, sticking my nose where it doesn't belong. It's gotten me into trouble more than once, but I never seem to learn. With a deep breath, I pulled the cardboard free and lifted the dumpster lid. The smell that wafted out made me recoil. I've smelled some foul things in this job, but this was different. This was the metallic tang of blood mixed with something else, something meaty. I fumbled for the flashlight on my belt, clicking it on with shaky hands. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the contents of the dumpster. At first, all I saw was the usual assortment of office trash. Crumpled papers, empty coffee cups, sandwich wrappers, but then my light fell on something that didn't belong. A hand, a human hand, partially obscured by a stack of flattened cardboard boxes. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. This couldn't be real. This had to be some sick joke, a Halloween prank gone too far. But deep down I knew it wasn't. The smell, the blood, it was all too real. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers clumsy as I tried to dial 911. But before I could hit the call button, a sound froze me in place. A scrape of gravel, so faint I almost missed it. I wasn't alone. Slowly I turned, sweeping my flashlight beam across the parking lot. The light bounced off rows of parked cars, creating deep shadows between them. Perfect hiding spots for whoever might be out there. "Hello?" I called out, hating how my voice quavered. "Is someone there?" Silence answered me, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, watching from the darkness. I backed up slowly, keeping my eyes on the lot as I edged towards my truck. My mind raced with possibilities. Had I interrupted someone in the act of disposing of a body? Were they still here, waiting to see what I'd do? I was about halfway to my truck when I heard it again. Another scrape of gravel, closer this time. My breath caught in my throat as I swung my flashlight towards the sound. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of movement. A dark figure ducking behind a car. My blood ran cold. That's when survival instinct kicked in. I turned and ran, no longer caring about stealth. I could hear footsteps behind me now, no longer trying to stay hidden. They were fast, gaining on me with every second. I reached my truck, yanking open the door and scrambling inside. My hands shook as I tried to get the key in the ignition. Come on, I muttered, glancing in the rearview mirror. A face appeared in the glass, so close I could see the wild look in the man's eyes. I yelled, fumbling with the lock just as he grabbed the door handle. The engine roared to life. I threw the truck into gear and stomped on the gas. The tires squealed as I peeled out of the parking lot, my pursuer's angry shouts fading behind me. I drove for what felt like hours, taking random turns, doubling back, doing everything I could to make sure I wasn't being followed. My mind was a whirlwind of panic and disbelief. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't happen in real life, not to ordinary guys like me. Eventually, I found myself in a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town. I sat in a booth, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee I couldn't bring myself to drink, trying to decide what to do. I should call the police. That was the right thing to do, the responsible thing. But a nagging voice in the back of my mind kept asking questions. What if they didn't believe me? What if whoever was behind this had connections, power? What if by reporting it I was putting myself in the crosshairs? As the sky outside began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I made my decision. I couldn't just pretend this hadn't happened. Whatever the consequences, I had to do the right thing. With trembling fingers, I dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? I took a deep breath. I need to report a body. I think I found a body. The next few hours passed in a blur. Police officers questioned me, first at the diner, then down at the station. I told them everything about the dumpster, the hand I saw, the man who chased me. They listened with serious expressions, taking notes and exchanging glances I couldn't interpret. "We'll send a team to investigate," one of the detectives told me. "In the meantime, Mr. Johnson, I'm going to need you to stay in town. We may have more questions for you." I nodded numbly, as if I could go anywhere. As if I could do anything but replay the night's events over and over in my mind, wondering if I could have done something differently. They released me late in the afternoon. I stumbled out of the police station, exhausted and dazed. The world felt different somehow, as if the events of the night had altered the very fabric of reality. I made my way home in a taxi, too shaken to drive myself. As we pulled up to my small apartment building, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A car I didn't recognize parked across the street. As I watched, the driver's side window rolled down just enough for me to catch a glimpse of the man inside. It was him. The man from the parking lot. He was watching my building, waiting for me. I told the taxi driver to keep going, my mind racing. I couldn't go home. It wasn't safe. But where could I go? What could I do? As the taxi pulled away, I caught one last glimpse of the man in the car. He was smiling, a cold, calculating smile that told me this was far from over. I realized then that my life had changed irrevocably. In the span of one night, I had gone from a simple garbage truck driver to a man on the run, tangled up in something far bigger and more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. As the taxi drove aimlessly through the city streets, I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I didn't know what was going to happen next, but I knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The memory of that hand in the dumpster, the chase through the dark parking lot, the man's face in my rearview mirror, it all swirled in my mind, a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. But this was real, all too real, and somehow I had to find a way to survive it. Story 4. The moment our tires crunched onto that dirt road, I knew we'd made a terrible mistake, but by then it was already too late. My name's Mike, and this was supposed to be a fun family road trip. Me, my wife Sarah, and our 2 kids, Emma, 14, and Tyler, 10. We'd been planning this cross-country adventure for months, mapping out all the cheesy roadside attractions and national parks we wanted to hit. But now, as the dense forest closed in around us and our cell signal faded to nothing, I realized how quickly a dream vacation could turn into a nightmare. It all started innocently enough. We were cruising down I-40 somewhere in the middle of nowhere between Amarillo and Albuquerque. The kids were getting restless in the back, and Sarah was trying to find a place to stop for lunch on her phone. "Hey, the GPS is showing a shortcut," she said, squinting at the screen. "Says it'll save us almost an hour." I glanced over, seeing the blue line veering off the highway onto a smaller road. "I don't know, babe. Doesn't look like much of a road on the map." Sarah shrugged. "The app says it's fine, plus it'll be more scenic than the highway. Come on, where's your sense of adventure?" I should have trusted my gut. But after hours of monotonous driving and whining from the back seat, the idea of a change of scenery was too tempting to pass up. "All right," I said, flicking on the turn signal. "Let's do it." The first few miles weren't so bad. The paved road wound through rolling hills with glimpses of distant mountains on the horizon. Emma even put down her phone for a moment to admire the view. "See," Sarah said, a smug smile on her face. "Told you this was a good idea." But then the pavement ended, giving way to a bumpy dirt road. I slowed down, our SUV jostling over the uneven surface. Dad?" Tyler piped up from the back. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" I glanced at the GPS. The blue line was still there, urging us forward. "Yeah, buddy, just a little detour. We'll be back on the main road soon." But we weren't. The dirt road narrowed, trees pressing in on both sides. The afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows across the windshield. It would have been beautiful if not for the growing knot of unease in my stomach. After about 20 minutes, Sarah frowned at her phone. "That's weird. I just lost signal. I checked my own phone. No bars." "Must be the trees," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'm sure we'll get it back once we're out of this forest." But the forest showed no signs of thinning. If anything, it seemed to be getting denser. The road twisted and turned, each bend looking exactly like the last. I couldn't shake the feeling we were going in circles. "Mike," Sarah said quietly so the kids couldn't hear. "Maybe we should turn around." I nodded, relief flooding through me at the suggestion. "Yeah, good idea. I'll just find a spot wide enough to..." My words were cut off as we rounded another bend. There, in the middle of the road, was a massive fallen tree. "Whoa!" Tyler exclaimed. "That's huge!" I brought the car to a stop, staring at the obstacle. The trunk was easily 3 feet thick, stretching across the entire width of the road. There was no way around it. "Guess we're turning around," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. I put the car in reverse, but as I looked over my shoulder, my heart sank. Another fallen tree blocked the road behind us. Sarah's eyes widened. "Mike, what's going on?" I killed the engine, my mind racing. This couldn't be a coincidence. 2 massive trees, perfectly positioned to trap us. Something was very, very wrong. "Okay, everyone stay calm," I said, unbuckling my seatbelt. "I'm going to check it out. Lock the doors behind me." As soon as I stepped out of the car, the silence hit me. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves in the wind. Just an eerie, oppressive quiet that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I approached the fallen tree, looking for any sign of how recently it had come down. The wood looked old, weathered. This thing hadn't just fallen. It had been here for a while. A twig snapped in the forest to my left. I whirled around, peering into the shadows between the trees. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. "Hey!" I called out, my voice sounding small in the vast silence. "Is anyone there? We could use some help." No response, just that same heavy quiet. I hurried back to the car, my heart pounding. As I reached for the door handle, movement in my peripheral vision made me freeze. I turned slowly, hardly daring to breathe. There at the edge of the trees stood a figure, human-shaped but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, its proportions slightly off in a way that sent chills down my spine. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there watching. I yanked the door open and threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming it shut behind me. "Mike, what is it?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with fear. I opened my mouth to respond, but movement outside the windshield caught my eye. More figures were emerging from the trees. 5, 10, a dozen of them, all with that same unsettling wrongness to their appearance. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered. Emma let out a small, terrified whimper from the back seat. The figures began to advance, moving with an unnatural, jerky gait. They spread out, surrounding the car. "Dad?" Tyler's voice quavered. "What do they want?" I wish I had an answer for him. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Who were these people? What did they want with us? One of the figures stepped closer, close enough that I could make out details of its face. My blood ran cold. Its features were blurred, indistinct, like a photograph that had been smeared. Where its eyes should have been were just dark, empty sockets. It reached out a long, spindly arm, fingers scraping against the driver's side window. "Go away!" Emma screamed, pressing herself against the far side of the car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the car into drive. "Hold on!" I yelled, stomping on the gas pedal. The SUV lurched forward, slamming into the fallen tree. The impact jolted us all forward, but the tree didn't budge. The figures were closing in, their blank faces pressed against every window. Fingers scrabbled at the doors, trying to find a way in. "The other way!" Sarah shouted. I threw the car into reverse, tires spinning in the dirt as we shot backward. We hit the other fallen tree with a sickening crunch of metal. We were trapped. The figures pressed closer, their bodies now entirely blocking our view out of the windows. The car rocked as they pushed against it, the metal groaning under the strain. "Mom, Dad, I'm scared," Tyler sobbed. "It's okay, baby," Sarah said, her voice surprisingly steady. "We're going to be okay." But as I looked at her, I saw the truth in her eyes. We both knew this might be it. I reached out and took her hand, squeezing it tightly. With my other hand, I fumbled for my phone. Still no signal, but maybe, just maybe. A loud crack split the air, and suddenly the windshield was covered in a spiderweb of fissures. One of the creatures had slammed its fist into the glass. Emma screamed. Tyler buried his face in his sister's shoulder. Another crack. The windshield bulged inward. In desperation, I did the only thing I could think of. I laid on the horn, the loud blare shattering the unnatural silence, and then miraculously the pressure on the car eased. The figures began to back away, their movements jerky and uncoordinated, as if the sound was causing them pain. I kept my hand pressed firmly on the horn, the noise deafening inside the car, but I didn't let up. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the creatures retreated back into the forest. Within minutes, they had vanished entirely, melting into the shadows between the trees as if they'd never been there at all. I waited a full 5 minutes after the last one disappeared before finally releasing the horn. The sudden silence was almost as shocking as the noise had been. We all sat there, breathing heavily, unable to believe what had just happened. Are they gone?" Emma whispered. I peered out the cracked windshield. The road was empty. No sign of the creatures, no sign that anything out of the ordinary had happened at all. Except for our battered car and the fallen trees, it could have been any normal stretch of forest. "I think so," I said, "but we need to get out of here. Now." It took some maneuvering, but we managed to squeeze the car between the fallen tree and the edge of the road. The undercarriage scraped and groaned in protest, but finally we were free. I drove as fast as I dared back the way we'd come, not slowing down until we finally, blessedly, reached the paved highway. We never did figure out what happened that day. The police were skeptical of our story, and without any evidence beyond our damaged car, there wasn't much they could do. But I'll tell you this, we never take shortcuts anymore. And whenever we're on a road trip, no matter how monotonous the highway gets, we stick to the main roads, because sometimes the scenic route isn't worth the risk. Story 5. The rusty wrench glinted in the fading sunlight, its jagged edges caked with something dark and flaking. My stomach churned as I realized what I was looking at. This wasn't rust. It was blood. I never should have accepted help from a stranger. But when you're stuck on a deserted highway with a broken-down car and a dying phone, your options are limited. Now, as I stood behind my stuttering Honda Civic, watching this large, bearded man root around in his truck bed, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. It all started about an hour earlier. I was driving back to campus after visiting my parents for the weekend. The spring break crowds had thinned out on the highways, leaving long stretches of empty road between pockets of traffic. I was enjoying the solitude, windows down, music up, singing along to my road trip playlist. That's when I heard it. A sputtering cough from the engine, followed by an ominous rattle. I barely had time to process what was happening before my car started losing power. Thankfully, there was a wide shoulder and I managed to coast to a stop safely off the road. I sat there for a moment, hands still gripping the wheel, hoping that maybe if I just waited, the car would magically fix itself. But the silence that filled the air told me otherwise. With a sigh, I popped the hood and got out to take a look. Now I'm no mechanic. My knowledge of cars extends about as far as knowing how to check the oil and fill up the windshield wiper fluid. So when I lifted the hood and peered inside, I might as well have been looking at an alien spaceship. Nothing seemed obviously wrong to my untrained eye, but then again, I wouldn't know if it did. I pulled out my phone, planning to call for a tow, only to see the dreaded low battery icon blinking at me. Of course, I'd been using it for GPS and hadn't thought to plug it in. I managed to fire off a quick text to my roommate letting her know I was having car trouble before the screen went black. That's when I heard the rumble of an approaching vehicle. A beat-up pickup truck slowed as it passed me, then pulled over about 50 feet ahead. Hope and apprehension battled in my chest as I watched a man climb out of the driver's seat. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick beard and calloused hands that spoke of manual labor. His faded jeans and work boots were streaked with dirt and grease. As he approached, he raised a hand in greeting. "Having some trouble there, miss?" His voice was deep and gravelly with a hint of a southern drawl. I nodded, trying to keep the nervousness out of my voice. "Yeah, it just died on me. I was about to call for a tow, but my phone's dead." He glanced at my open hood. "Mind if I take a look? I'm pretty handy with engines." Every instinct told me to say no, to politely decline and wait for another car to pass. But the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty highway. Who knew how long I'd be waiting for help? And he seemed nice enough, just a good Samaritan trying to help a stranded motorist. So I agreed, stepping back as he leaned under the hood. I watched as he poked and prodded, muttering to himself. After a few minutes, he straightened up. "Looks like your alternator's shot. That's why your battery died too. You're not going anywhere without replacing it." My heart sank. This was going to be expensive. "I don't suppose you happen to have a spare alternator lying around?" I joked weakly. To my surprise, he nodded. As a matter of fact, I might. I do a lot of salvage work. Let me check my truck. As he walked back to his pickup, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Maybe this wasn't going to be so bad after all. I'd lucked out, finding someone who could actually help me. That relief evaporated the moment I saw the wrench. He was digging through a toolbox in the truck bed when I spotted it. At first, I thought it was just dirty, but as he shifted some things around, a ray of sunlight caught the metal. That's when I saw the unmistakable reddish-brown stains. My blood ran cold as I realized what I was looking at. I froze, my mind racing. What do I do? Run? But to where? We were miles from anywhere, and I'd never outrun his truck. Scream? Who would hear me out here? He must have sensed something was wrong because he turned to look at me. Our eyes met, and in that moment I saw the change come over him. The friendly mask slipped, revealing something cold and predatory underneath. "Everything all right?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, just wondering how much longer this might take. It's getting dark." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, don't you worry about that. We've got all the time in the world." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he must be able to hear it. I needed to get out of here now. But how? That's when I remembered. The small canister of pepper spray my dad had insisted I keep in my glove compartment. If I could just get to it without him noticing. "You know," I said, forcing a smile, "I just remembered I have a power bank in my car. Maybe I could charge my phone enough to call for a tow. Not that I don't appreciate your help, but I wouldn't want to take up any more of your time." I started to move towards the passenger side door, trying to appear casual. He watched me, his stance shifting slightly to block my path to the road. Now, he said, his voice low and menacing. "Why don't we just finish what we started here? I'm sure we can get your car running in no time." He took a step towards me, the wrench still in his hand. I knew I had seconds to act. I lunged for the car door, yanking it open and diving across the seat. I could hear him behind me, his heavy footsteps pounding on the asphalt. My fingers scrabbled frantically in the glove compartment, searching for the pepper spray. Just as my hand closed around the small canister, I felt his grip on my ankle. He started to pull me out of the car, his strength far outmatching mine. In desperation, I twisted around and aimed the pepper spray at his face. I didn't wait to see if I'd hit my target. The moment I felt his grip loosen, I kicked free and scrambled out the driver's side door. His agonized yells told me I'd found my mark. I ran, not daring to look back, my legs pumping as fast as they could carry me. I heard him cursing, the sound of something metal clattering to the ground, probably the wrench. I ran until my lungs burned, until the sound of his shouts faded behind me. Only then did I risk a glance over my shoulder. The highway stretched out empty behind me, no sign of pursuit. Still, I didn't slow down. The adrenaline coursing through my veins pushed me forward, even as my muscles screamed in protest. I had no idea how far I'd run or how long I'd been running. All I knew was that I needed to put as much distance between me and that truck as possible. It was fully dark now, the only light coming from the occasional passing car. Each set of headlights made me flinch, terrified that he'd managed to get back in his truck and come after me. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes or so, I spotted a gas station up ahead, its fluorescent lights a beacon of hope in the darkness. I staggered into the parking lot, gasping for breath. The cashier looked alarmed as I burst through the door, wild-eyed and out of breath. "Please," I managed to gasp out, "I need to use your phone. There's a man, my car. He tried to..." I couldn't get the words out coherently, but the cashier seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. She quickly handed me the store phone and asked if she should call the police. I nodded gratefully as I dialed 911 with shaking fingers. As I waited for the operator to pick up, I kept my eyes glued to the highway, watching for any sign of a familiar truck. The next few hours passed in a blur of police statements and questions. They sent cars out to where I'd left my Honda, but both it and the man's truck were gone. They took down his description and the details of his vehicle, promising to keep an eye out. A kind deputy drove me back to campus, where my roommate was waiting, frantic with worry after my cryptic text hours earlier. As I sank into her hug, the reality of what had almost happened finally hit me. I broke down, sobs racking my body as the fear and adrenaline finally gave way to relief. In the days that followed, I jumped at every sound, flinched at every bearded man I saw on the street. The police never found him or my car. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember the wrench, the look in his eyes, and I know it was all too real. I still drive that stretch of highway sometimes. I have to visit my parents. But now I make sure my phone is always charged. I don't stop for anyone. And I never ever travel alone. Because I learned something that day, something I'll never forget. Sometimes the real monsters aren't hiding under your bed or in the shadows. Sometimes they're right there in broad daylight, offering you a helping hand. And by the time you realize the danger, it might already be too late. Story 6. The ping of a new order usually meant easy money. Tonight, it was the sound of my worst nightmare beginning. I'd been a motorcycle food delivery driver for just over a year, working the late-night shift to supplement my daytime job. It was usually uneventful, mostly drunk college kids ordering pizzas or insomniacs craving tacos at 2 a.m. But this order was different from the moment it came through. The address was unfamiliar, way out on the edges of my usual delivery zone. The pin on the map showed a house set back from the main road at the end of a long driveway. Something about it made me hesitate, my thumb hovering over the accept button. But rent was due next week, and I needed every extra dollar I could get. With a sigh, I tapped the screen. "You've got this, Marco," I muttered to myself as I swung my leg over my beat-up Kawasaki. The engine sputtered to life, and I pulled out of the parking lot of the 24-hour burger joint I'd been waiting at. The night was unusually quiet for a Friday. A thin fog had rolled in, muffling the usual sounds of the city and making the streetlights look like hazy orbs floating in the darkness. As I rode further from the center of town, the buildings grew sparse, replaced by open fields and the occasional farmhouse. I should have trusted my gut. Should have canceled the order and gone home. But I didn't. And that decision would haunt me for a long time to come. After about 20 minutes of riding, I spotted the turnoff for the address. The driveway was long and winding, bordered by overgrown hedges that seemed to close in behind me as I rode past. The fog was thicker here, and I had to slow down to avoid missing any sudden turns. Finally, the house came into view, or what was left of it. In the dim moonlight filtering through the fog, I could see a dilapidated 2-story farmhouse, its paint peeling and several windows boarded up. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. I pulled up to what remained of the front porch, the wooden steps sagging dangerously. The house loomed over me, dark and silent. No lights, no sign of life, just the creaking of old timber in the night breeze. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and uncertain in the oppressive quiet. "Food delivery." No response. I pulled out my phone, thinking maybe I had the wrong address. But no, this was definitely the place. I tried calling the customer, but it went straight to voicemail. That's when I heard it, a muffled sound coming from inside the house. It was faint but unmistakable. A voice. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. "Is someone there? I've got your food order." The voice came again, clearer this time. It sounded like someone calling for help. Every instinct told me to get back on my bike and get the hell out of there. But what if someone really was in trouble? I couldn't just leave without checking. Cautiously, I approached the front door. It was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. I pushed it open, wincing at the loud creak of rusted hinges. "Hello?" I called into the darkness. "Is anyone here? Do you need help?" The interior of the house was a mess. Broken furniture, peeling wallpaper, dust coating every surface. The air was thick with the musty smell of decay. I took a few steps inside, my footsteps echoing on the bare wooden floor. That's when I heard it again, the voice. It was coming from upstairs. Against my better judgment, I started climbing the staircase. Each step groaned under my weight, and I found myself holding my breath, straining to hear any other sounds. At the top of the stairs, a long hallway stretched out before me, doors lining both sides. All were closed except for one at the far end, which was slightly open. A faint light flickered from within. "Hello?" I called again, my voice shaky. "I'm here to help." "Where are you?" No response this time, just the continued flickering of light from the room at the end of the hall. I approached slowly, my heart pounding so loud I was sure anyone in the house could hear it. As I got closer to the door, I could hear something, not a voice this time, but a different sound, electronic, familiar somehow. I pushed the door open. The room was empty except for an old TV set in the corner, its screen flickering with static. And propped up against it, illuminated by the pale light of the screen, was a cell phone. My blood ran cold as I realized it was playing a recording of a voice calling for help. It was a trap, and I'd walked right into it. I spun around ready to run, but froze at the sight before me. Blocking the doorway was a figure, tall and imposing, face hidden in shadow. "Well, well," a deep voice rumbled. "Looks like dinner's been delivered after all." I didn't think, I just reacted. I charged forward, catching the figure off guard and managing to slip past. I heard a roar of anger behind me as I sprinted down the hallway, taking the stairs 2 at a time. I burst out of the front door, gasping for air, my legs pumping furiously as I raced towards my bike. That's when I heard it, the shrill wail of my motorcycle's alarm piercing through the night. My heart sank. In my panic to get away, I'd hit the alarm button on my key fob instead of the ignition. And now, my only means of escape was announcing its location to whoever was chasing me. I reached the bike, fumbling with the keys, trying to silence the alarm and start the engine. But my hands were shaking so badly I kept missing the ignition. Heavy footsteps pounded behind me, getting closer. Finally, the key slid home. I turned it, praying to whatever God might be listening. The engine sputtered once, twice. A hand grabbed the back of my jacket, yanking me backward. I yelled, twisting in the iron grip, kicking out blindly. My foot connected with something solid. I heard a grunt of pain, and suddenly I was free. Not wasting a second, I leaped onto the bike. The engine roared to life. I gunned it, not even bothering to put on my helmet. Gravel sprayed as the rear wheel spun, and then I was moving, tearing down the driveway at a speed that was definitely not safe in this fog. I didn't slow down until I was back on the main road, the sinister house far behind me. Only then did I pull over, my whole body shaking with adrenaline and fear. What the hell had just happened? Who was that in the house? And why had they set such an elaborate trap? I pulled out my phone with trembling hands, ready to call the police. But as the screen lit up, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A new notification from the food delivery app. Order canceled by customer. Reason, driver never arrived. I stared at the screen in disbelief. The order was gone, as if it had never existed. There was no record of the address I'd been sent to, no customer name, nothing. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the implications. Whoever had set this up had access to the app's systems. They could create and delete orders at will. How many other drivers had they lured out here? And what had happened to them? I knew I should go to the police, tell them everything. But would they believe me? I had no proof. No order history, no recording of the call for help. Just my word against whoever was behind this. As I sat there trying to decide what to do, my phone pinged again, a new order. For a moment, I was tempted to throw the phone as far as I could and never look at it again. But curiosity got the better of me. I opened the app. It was another order, to the same address. My hands shook as I stared at the screen. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a mistake. Or maybe it was a chance. A chance to go back, to gather evidence, to stop whoever was doing this before they could hurt anyone else. Or maybe it was suicide. I sat there for what felt like hours, the fog swirling around me as I wrestled with the decision. In the distance, I could hear the faint wail of sirens. Someone, somewhere, was in trouble, just like I had been. Just like the next unsuspecting driver would be if I didn't do something. With a deep breath, I put on my helmet and started the engine. I didn't know what I was going to do when I got there, but I knew I couldn't just ride away and pretend this never happened. As I pulled back onto the road, heading once again towards the house that had nearly been my doom, one thought kept running through my mind. This was going to be one hell of a story to tell the cops, if I survived to tell it. Story 7. The night air was thick with the smell of rain and pine as I pulled onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under my tires. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating a beat-up sedan with its hazards blinking weakly. I'd been a highway patrol officer for 15 years, but something about this scene made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to be a routine stop. I'm Officer Sarah Reeves, and this is the night that almost cost me everything. It was just past 2 a.m., and I was nearing the end of my shift. The stretch of highway I was patrolling was notorious for its sharp turns and steep drop-offs, especially treacherous on rainy nights like this. I'd seen my fair share of accidents here, but something about this particular scene felt off from the moment I spotted it. I radioed in my location before stepping out of my cruiser. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reeves. I'm stopping to assist a stranded motorist at mile marker 237. Over." "Copy that, Officer Reeves. Be advised, backup is currently engaged with a multi-car pileup about 30 miles south. You're on your own for now. Stay safe out there." "Great. Just what I needed to hear." I approached the vehicle cautiously, one hand resting on my holstered weapon. The driver's side window was rolled down and a man's face peered out at me. He looked to be in his mid-30s, with disheveled brown hair and a days-old stubble. "Evening, sir," I said, keeping my tone professional but friendly. "Having some car trouble?" The man nodded, flashing a relieved smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Oh, thank God you're here, officer. Yeah, my engine just died on me out of nowhere. I've been stuck here for hours." I glanced at the hood of the car. No steam, no signs of overheating. Strange for an engine that had supposedly just given out. "Mind if I take a look?" I asked, already moving towards the front of the vehicle. "Oh, sure," the man replied, a hint of hesitation in his voice. "But I'm pretty sure it's the alternator. Probably not much you can do here." I popped the hood and peered inside, my flashlight revealing an engine that looked perfectly fine. No obvious leaks, no frayed belts, nothing that would explain a sudden breakdown. "Sir, when exactly did your car stop running?" I asked, closing the hood. The man paused for a beat too long. "About 3 hours ago, I think. It's been a long night." I nodded, making a mental note of the inconsistency. 3 hours was a long time to be stranded without calling for a tow. "Can I see your license and registration, please?" He fumbled in his pockets, eventually producing a driver's license that looked legitimate at first glance. "Sorry, my registration's in the glove box. Mind if I grab it?" I tensed slightly as he reached across to the passenger side. That's when I noticed it. A small smear of what looked like blood on the cuff of his jacket. My instincts kicked into high gear. Something was very, very wrong here. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," I said, my hand moving back to my weapon. The man's demeanor changed instantly. The friendly smile vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating look that sent chills down my spine. "I don't think that's necessary, officer," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Why don't you just get back in your car and drive away? Pretend you never saw me." I unclipped my holster, adrenaline surging through my veins. "Sir, I won't ask again. Step out of the vehicle now." For a moment, neither of us moved. The only sound was the patter of rain on the road and the distant rumble of thunder. Then, in a blur of motion, the man lunged across the seat. I drew my weapon, but I was a split second too late. The muzzle of a gun poked out of the window, pointed directly at my chest. "Drop it!" the man snarled. Now, my mind raced, assessing options. I was out in the open, no cover in sight. The closest backup was at least 30 minutes away, and this man, whoever he was, clearly had no qualms about shooting a police officer. Slowly, deliberately, I placed my gun on the ground and raised my hands. "Smart move," the man said, a twisted smile playing on his lips. "Now here's what's going to happen. You're going to get in your car and drive away. If I see any signs of you calling this in, I start shooting. Understand?" I nodded, trying to keep my face neutral despite the fear coursing through me. As I took a step back towards my cruiser, my foot brushed against something in the gravel. My flashlight, which I dropped when drawing my weapon, an idea formed, desperate, dangerous, but possibly my only shot. "Wait," I said, keeping my hands visible. "My dash cam. It's been recording this whole time. If I leave now, it'll have footage of you threatening an officer." The man's eyes widened slightly. He clearly hadn't considered this. "Turn it off," he demanded. "Now." I nodded, moving slowly towards my cruiser. Okay. I'm going to reach inside and turn it off. Don't shoot." As I leaned into the car, I grabbed the flashlight from where it lay hidden by the open door. In one fluid motion, I whirled around and flung it directly at the man's face. The flashlight connected with a satisfying thunk. The man yelped in pain and surprise, his gun hand wavering for just a moment. But a moment was all I needed. I charged forward, tackling him through the open car window. We tumbled onto the road in a tangle of limbs, the gun skittering away across the asphalt. The man fought like a cornered animal, all desperation and fury. He was stronger than me, but I had years of training on my side. We grappled on the wet pavement, each struggling for the upper hand. A sharp pain exploded in my ribs as he landed a solid punch. I gasped, momentarily stunned, and he used the opportunity to scramble for his gun. Time seemed to slow down. I saw his fingers close around the grip, saw him start to turn towards me. In that instant, I knew that if I didn't act, I was going to die on this lonely stretch of highway. With every ounce of strength I had left, I launched myself at him. My shoulder connected with his midsection, driving the air from his lungs. The gun went flying once more, disappearing into the darkness beyond the reach of my cruiser's headlights. We hit the ground hard, and this time I made sure to stay on top. I pinned his arms, using my body weight to keep him immobilized. "It's over," I panted, reaching for my handcuffs. "You're under arrest." The fight seemed to go out of him all at once. As I secured the cuffs, I finally got a good look at the inside of his car. What I saw made my blood run cold. The back seat was covered in plastic sheeting. A duffel bag lay open, revealing coils of rope and a set of wickedly sharp knives. And there, peeking out from under a tarp, was a woman's shoe. I swallowed hard, the full gravity of the situation hitting me. This wasn't just a random criminal I'd stumbled upon. This was a predator, and I'd likely interrupted him in the middle of something horrific. "Officer Reeves to dispatch," I said into my radio, my voice shaking slightly. "I need immediate backup and a forensics team at my location. Suspect in custody, possible homicide. Bomb." As I waited for backup to arrive, I kept my gun trained on the man, who now lay silent and sullen on the wet pavement. The rain had picked up, washing away the small specks of blood from our scuffle. I couldn't help but think about how close I'd come to being another victim, another tragedy on this dangerous stretch of road. If I hadn't trusted my instincts, if I'd let my guard down for even a moment. The distant wail of sirens snapped me back to the present. Backup was finally on its way. As the first cruiser crested the hill, lights flashing, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. The suspect was taken into custody, the car was impounded, and a full investigation was launched. It would be days before we knew the full extent of his crimes, but the evidence found in his vehicle painted a grim picture. As I finally headed home, the sun peeking over the horizon, I couldn't shake the image of that woman's shoe from my mind. Had I saved a life tonight, or had I simply caught a killer after the fact? One thing was certain, I'd never look at a routine traffic stop the same way again. In our line of work, you never know when a seemingly ordinary night might turn into something much darker. All we can do is trust our training, follow our instincts, and hope that when the moment comes, we're ready to face whatever waits for us in the darkness. As I pulled into my driveway, exhausted but alive, I made a silent promise to myself and to every motorist I'd encounter in the future. I would never ignore that gut feeling again, because out there on the lonely highways, sometimes intuition is all that stands between life and death. Story 8. The trunk slammed shut, and in that moment, I knew this routine traffic stop was about to become the most harrowing night of my career. My name is Sarah Reeves, and I've been a highway patrol officer for 8 years. I've seen my fair share of strange and dangerous situations, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night on a lonely stretch of Interstate 80. It was a quiet Tuesday evening in late September. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fading shades of orange and purple. I was parked in my usual spot, partially hidden behind a cluster of trees off the shoulder of the highway. My radar gun showed most drivers were behaving themselves, probably eager to get home after a long day at work. Just as I was considering calling it a night, a silver sedan flew past me, the radar clocking it at 87 in a 65 zone. With a sigh, I flicked on my lights and pulled out onto the highway. Just another speeder, I thought. How wrong I was. The car took longer than usual to pull over, which immediately put me on alert. When it finally came to a stop on the shoulder, I noticed the driver making frantic movements inside. Red flag number 2. I approached the vehicle cautiously, one hand resting on my holstered weapon. As I got closer, I could see the driver was a middle-aged man, probably in his late 40s. He was gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white, staring straight ahead. "License and registration, please," I said, keeping my tone professional but firm. The man jumped as if he hadn't noticed me approach, which was impossible given my flashing lights. He fumbled in his glove compartment, hands shaking as he retrieved his documents. "Do you know why I pulled you over tonight, sir?" I asked, studying his face. He was sweating profusely despite the cool evening air. I was speeding, wasn't I?" he stammered, still not making eye contact. "I'm sorry, officer. I'm late for an important meeting." I nodded, taking the license and registration back to my cruiser to run his information. John Doe, 47 years old, no priors. The car was registered in his name. Everything checked out, but something still felt off. I returned to the vehicle, handing back his documents. "Mr. Doe, I'm going to let you off with a warning tonight, but I need you to slow down, all right? It's not worth risking your life or anyone else's." He nodded vigorously, relief washing over his face. "Yes, of course. Thank you, officer. It won't happen again." I was about to let him go when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, on the back of his left hand, was a smear of what looked unmistakably like blood. "Sir, is everything all right? Are you injured?" I asked, my hand instinctively moving closer to my weapon. His eyes widened and he quickly pulled his hand out of sight. "What? No, I'm fine. It's just paint. I was doing some home improvement earlier. I knew I should let it go." He had a clean record and I had no probable cause, but every instinct I had developed over my years on the force was screaming that something was very, very wrong. "Mr. Doe, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," I said, my voice calm but brooking no argument. He hesitated, panic flashing across his face. Is that really necessary, officer? I promise I'll drive safely from here on out." "Sir, please step out of the vehicle now," I repeated, my hand now resting on my holstered weapon. Slowly, reluctantly, he opened the door and got out. As he did, I caught a whiff of something metallic and sickeningly sweet, the smell of blood. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time. Are you injured? Is there someone else in the vehicle who might be hurt?" He shook his head vehemently, but his eyes kept darting to the trunk of the car. That's when I heard it, a faint thump coming from the back of the vehicle. My heart started racing. "Mr. Doe, I need you to open the trunk of your vehicle right now." I can't do that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, open the trunk now, or I will be forced to detain you and call for backup." For a moment I thought he was going to comply. Then without warning he lunged at me. I was caught off guard, stumbling backward as he barreled past me towards the driver's side door. Training kicked in. I regained my balance and drew my weapon in one fluid motion. "Stop right there," I shouted. "Hands where I can see them." But he wasn't listening. He yanked open the car door and threw himself inside. I could hear the engine roaring to life. I had a split-second decision to make. If I let him drive away, God knows what would happen to whoever was in that trunk. But if I used lethal force and I was wrong about this, the car's tires squealed as it began to pull away. I aimed at the rear tire and fired. The shot rang out, echoing across the empty highway. The tire exploded and the car swerved violently before coming to a stop a few yards away. I approached cautiously, weapon still drawn. "Get out of the vehicle with your hands up," I shouted. To my surprise, he complied this time. He stumbled out of the car, hands raised, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he kept mumbling. "I'm so sorry." I quickly cuffed him and secured him in the back of my cruiser. Then, with my heart in my throat, I approached the trunk of his car. The thumping sound was louder now, more frantic. Using the keys I'd taken from the ignition, I popped the trunk open. Nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. A young woman, bound and gagged, her eyes wide with terror. She was covered in bruises and there was blood matting her hair. But she was alive. I quickly removed the gag and started working on the ropes binding her hands and feet. "It's okay," I kept saying, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're safe now. I'm a police officer. You're going to be okay." As soon as she was free, she threw her arms around me, sobbing uncontrollably. I held her, my mind reeling from what had just transpired. If I hadn't noticed that blood smear, if I had let him drive away. I radioed for backup and an ambulance. As we waited, I sat with the young woman wrapped in a shock blanket in the back of my cruiser. John Doe sat in the other cruiser that had arrived, staring blankly ahead. The woman's name was Emily. She told me between sobs that she had been kidnapped 3 days ago from a parking lot. John Doe, it turned out, was a serial kidnapper who had been operating across 3 states. Emily was his 4th victim. The first three hadn't been as lucky. As the ambulance arrived and the detectives began to take over the scene, I found myself standing alone by my cruiser, watching the flashing lights illuminate the night. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me shaky and nauseous. I had always prided myself on being a good cop, on trusting my instincts. But this was something else entirely. If I had ignored that nagging feeling, if I had let him drive away with just a warning... A detective approached me, pulling me out of my thoughts. "Officer Reeves, we're going to need your statement." I nodded, taking a deep breath to steady myself. As I followed him to give my account of what happened, I couldn't shake the image of Emily's terrified face when I opened that trunk. I knew it would haunt me for a long time to come. But I also knew that I had made a difference tonight. I had saved a life, and in this job, sometimes that's all you can hope for. As I recounted the events to the detective, I realized that this night would change me forever. It would make me more cautious, more observant. It would remind me that sometimes the most routine situations can turn into matters of life and death in the blink of an eye. And as I drove home that night, exhausted but unable to sleep, I knew one thing for certain. I would never again underestimate the importance of trusting my instincts, because sometimes that's all that stands between a routine traffic stop and a nightmare. Story 9. The neon sign of Luigi's Pizza flickered in the rearview mirror as I pulled away, the aroma of garlic and cheese still clinging to my jacket. It was supposed to be my last delivery of the night, a simple drop-off to make a few extra bucks before heading home. I had no idea I was about to walk into a nightmare that would change my life forever. My name's Jake, and I've been a food delivery driver for the past 2 years. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills while I finish up my degree. Most nights are a blur of apartment complexes and suburban homes punctuated by the occasional drunk college student or grumpy customer. But this night was different. It was just past 11 p.m. when the order came through on my app. A large pepperoni pizza and 2-liter soda, nothing out of the ordinary. The address was for a house on the outskirts of town, a good 20-minute drive. I almost declined it. It was late, and I was ready to call it a night. But the promised tip was generous, and I figured one more delivery wouldn't hurt. The GPS led me down increasingly dark and narrow roads. Houses became fewer and farther between, replaced by dense woods and the occasional dilapidated barn. Just as I was starting to wonder if I'd taken a wrong turn, I saw it. A large Victorian-style house looming at the end of a long driveway. The place looked like something out of a horror movie. Paint peeling, shutters hanging askew, overgrown vines creeping up the walls. A single light burned in an upstairs window, casting eerie shadows across the front porch. I pulled up to the house, killing the engine but leaving the headlights on. As I grabbed the pizza and soda from the passenger seat, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. The porch steps creaked ominously under my feet as I approached the front door. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that I was being ridiculous. It was just an old house, nothing to be afraid of. I rang the doorbell, wincing at the harsh buzz that echoed through the house. For a long moment, nothing happened. I was just about to ring again when I heard shuffling footsteps approach. The door creaked open, revealing a middle-aged man with thinning hair and thick-rimmed glasses. He peered at me nervously, eyes darting past me to scan the darkness beyond. "Pizza delivery," I said, plastering on my best customer service smile. "Oh yes, of course," the man replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please come in. I have to get my wallet from upstairs." Warning bells immediately went off in my head. Every delivery driver knows the golden rule: never enter a customer's house. But before I could protest, the man continued. "I'm so sorry to ask, but I have a disability that makes it difficult for me to carry things up the stairs. Would you mind terribly bringing the pizza to the dining room? It's just through there." He gestured vaguely towards an interior doorway, his expression pleading. Against my better judgment, I found myself nodding. "Sure, no problem," I heard myself say, even as every instinct screamed at me to leave. I stepped into the house, the floorboards groaning under my feet. The entryway was dimly lit and cluttered with stacks of old newspapers and books. The air was thick with the musty smell of neglect. "The dining room's just through there," the man said, pointing again before shuffling towards the staircase. "I'll be right back with your payment." I watched him disappear up the stairs, then turned towards the indicated doorway. As I entered the dining room, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The room was large and sparsely furnished, dominated by a long table with several chairs, but it was the far corner that caught my attention. A woman sat there, bound to a chair with duct tape across her mouth. Her eyes were wide with terror, silently pleading for help. My heart leapt into my throat. This wasn't a simple delivery. I'd walked right into the middle of a hostage situation. For a moment, I stood frozen, my mind racing. Should I run? Try to help the woman? Call the police? Before I could decide, a voice behind me made me jump. "I see you've met my guest." I whirled around to find the man standing in the doorway, all trace of nervousness gone from his demeanor. In his hand was a pistol pointed directly at my chest. "Put the pizza down and take a seat," he said, gesturing to one of the empty chairs with his gun. My hands shook as I set the pizza and soda on the table. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble. I'll just leave, okay? Forget I saw anything." The man's laugh was cold and humorless. "I'm afraid that's not an option. Sit down." I sank into the nearest chair, my legs feeling like jelly. The woman in the corner made a muffled sound behind her gag, tears streaming down her face. "Now then," the man said, pulling out his own chair while keeping the gun trained on me. "Let's all have a nice dinner, shall we?" My mind raced, searching desperately for a way out of this nightmare. The man seemed unstable, unpredictable. One wrong move could get me or the woman killed. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The man's eyes narrowed. "That's not your concern. Your job right now is to sit there and be quiet. Understand?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As the man busied himself with opening the pizza box, I cast another glance at the bound woman. She was staring at me intently, her eyes flicking toward something on the floor near her feet. Following her gaze, I saw a shard of broken glass, barely visible in the dim light. Had she managed to break something earlier, hoping for a chance to cut her bonds? The man was distracted, struggling to pour soda into glasses with one hand while keeping the gun pointed in our general direction. This might be my only chance. Moving as slowly and casually as I could, I slid my foot across the floor, inching it towards the glass shard. The woman's eyes widened, understanding dawning on her face. "So," the man said suddenly, making me freeze. "How long have you been a delivery driver?" I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze. About 2 years now." As I spoke, I resumed inching my foot forward, just a little further. He peered at me nervously, eyes darting past me to scan the darkness beyond. "Pizza delivery," I said, plastering on my best customer service smile. "Oh yes, of course," the man replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please come in. I have to get my wallet from upstairs." Warning bells immediately went off in my head. Every delivery driver knows the golden rule: never enter a customer's house. But before I could protest, the man continued. "I'm so sorry to ask, but I have a disability that makes it difficult for me to carry things up the stairs. Would you mind terribly bringing the pizza to the dining room? It's just through there." He gestured vaguely towards an interior doorway, his expression pleading. Against my better judgment, I found myself nodding. "Sure, no problem," I heard myself say, even as every instinct screamed at me to leave. I stepped into the house, the floorboards groaning under my feet. The entryway was dimly lit and cluttered with stacks of old newspapers and books. The air was thick with the musty smell of neglect. "The dining room's just through there," the man said, pointing again before shuffling towards the staircase. "I'll be right back with your payment." I watched him disappear up the stairs, then turned towards the indicated doorway. As I entered the dining room, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The room was large and sparsely furnished, dominated by a long table with several chairs, but it was the far corner that caught my attention. A woman sat there, bound to a chair with duct tape across her mouth. Her eyes were wide with terror, silently pleading for help. My heart leapt into my throat. This wasn't a simple delivery. I'd walked right into the middle of a hostage situation. For a moment, I stood frozen, my mind racing. Should I run? Try to help the woman? Call the police? Before I could decide, a voice behind me made me jump. "I see you've met my guest." I whirled around to find the man standing in the doorway, all trace of nervousness gone from his demeanor. In his hand was a pistol pointed directly at my chest. "Put the pizza down and take a seat," he said, gesturing to one of the empty chairs with his gun. My hands shook as I set the pizza and soda on the table. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble. I'll just leave, okay? Forget I saw anything." The man's laugh was cold and humorless. "I'm afraid that's not an option. Sit down." I sank into the nearest chair, my legs feeling like jelly. The woman in the corner made a muffled sound behind her gag, tears streaming down her face. "Now then," the man said, pulling out his own chair while keeping the gun trained on me. "Let's all have a nice dinner, shall we?" My mind raced, searching desperately for a way out of this nightmare. The man seemed unstable, unpredictable. One wrong move could get me or the woman killed. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The man's eyes narrowed. "That's not your concern. Your job right now is to sit there and be quiet. Understand?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As the man busied himself with opening the pizza box, I cast another glance at the bound woman. She was staring at me intently, her eyes flicking toward something on the floor near her feet. Following her gaze, I saw a shard of broken glass, barely visible in the dim light. Had she managed to break something earlier, hoping for a chance to cut her bonds? The man was distracted, struggling to pour soda into glasses with one hand while keeping the gun pointed in our general direction. This might be my only chance. Moving as slowly and casually as I could, I slid my foot across the floor, inching it towards the glass shard. The woman's eyes widened, understanding dawning on her face. "So," the man said suddenly, making me freeze, "how long have you been a delivery driver?" I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze. About 2 years now." As I spoke, I resumed inching my foot forward, just a little further. Long nights on lonely highways, sketchy rest stops, and my fair share of close calls with drowsy drivers. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened at the Millbrook Way station on that moonless Tuesday night. The day had started like any other. I'd picked up my load in Tulsa, a trailer full of auto parts bound for a factory in Tennessee. The dispatcher had warned me about some road work that might slow me down, so I decided to push through the night to make up time. By 2 a.m., I was approaching the Tennessee state line. My eyelids were getting heavy, and I was looking forward to my mandatory break. That's when I saw the signs for the way station. Now, most truckers I know hate these stops. They're time-consuming, and if your paperwork isn't perfect or your load is even slightly off, you can end up with hefty fines. But they're part of the job, and this one was mandatory. I signaled and pulled off the highway, following the line of reflective markers guiding me towards the station. As I approached, something felt off. The place was lit up like a Christmas tree, but I didn't see any other trucks. Usually these stations have at least a few rigs lined up, especially at night when a lot of us long haulers are on the road. I pulled up to the scale, the familiar hum of my engine, the only sound breaking the silence. That should have been my first clue that something wasn't right. These places are never this quiet. I waited for the green light to pull onto the scale, but it never came. After a few minutes, I decided to get out and check what was going on. Maybe their system was down. The moment I stepped out of my cab, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. There was an atmosphere about the place, a heaviness that I couldn't explain. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud as I approached the scale operator's booth. The booth was empty, not just unmanned, but completely bare. No computer, no paperwork, not even a chair. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, not hours. I felt the first stirrings of real unease. This wasn't just unusual, it was wrong. I turned back to my truck, intending to get the hell out of there. Mandatory weigh-in be damned. That's when I noticed the barrier. The metal arm that's supposed to lift and let trucks pass after weighing was down. And not just down, it looked different. Thicker, sturdier. As I got closer, I realized with growing horror that this wasn't the standard barrier. This was something else entirely, something that looked like it could stop a tank. I jogged back to my truck, my heart starting to race. I climbed into the cab and fired up the engine, deciding I'd just ram through the barrier if I had to. But as I put the truck in gear and started to move, the wheels spun uselessly. I wasn't going anywhere. Confused, I hopped out again and went to check the scale. That's when I saw those red zeros blinking at me. According to the scale, my fully loaded 18-wheeler weighed nothing at all. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when I heard it, a scream, distant but unmistakable, coming from somewhere beyond the line of trees bordering the way station. Every instinct told me to get back in my truck, to lock the doors and wait for morning. But something, curiosity, stupidity, or maybe some misplaced sense of duty, made me hesitate. I pulled out my flashlight and started walking towards the tree line. The beam of light seemed feeble against the pressing darkness. As I got closer to the trees, I noticed something strange about them. They seemed off somehow. The shapes were wrong, too angular, too uniform. It wasn't until I was almost upon them that I realized what I was looking at. They weren't trees at all. They were trucks. Dozens of them, maybe more, all parked in neat rows, their dark silhouettes blending into the night. I approached the nearest one, my flashlight beam revealing a layer of dust and grime so thick it must have been sitting there for months, maybe years. The license plate was from Oregon, the door handle stuck when I tried it. I moved to the next truck and the next. All the same, abandoned, covered in dust, doors locked tight. It was like some kind of truck graveyard. Another scream pierced the night, closer this time. It was followed by the sound of metal scraping against metal, a harsh grating noise that set my teeth on edge. I swung my flashlight towards the sound, and for a split second I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure impossibly tall and thin, moving between the trucks with a jerky, unnatural gait. Then it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I ran. I ran faster than I ever have in my life, back towards my truck, towards safety. But as I burst out of the line of abandoned rigs, I realized with growing horror that I couldn't see my truck. The way station was empty. I spun around, disoriented, my flashlight beam cutting frantic arcs through the darkness. That's when I saw the booth. But it wasn't empty anymore. A man sat inside, his face illuminated by the glow of a computer screen. He looked up as I approached, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Finally, someone who could explain what the hell was going on. But as I got closer, that relief turned to ice in my veins. The man's eyes were wrong, completely black. No whites visible at all, and his smile was too wide, stretching literally from ear to ear. "Welcome to Millbrook," he said, his voice a raspy whisper that somehow carried clearly to where I stood. "We've been expecting you." I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. This had to be a dream, a hallucination brought on by too many hours on the road. The thing in the booth, I couldn't think of it as a man anymore, stood up. As it moved, I realized with growing horror that its body didn't move right. It was as if it had too many joints, bending in ways that should have been impossible. "Your truck has been processed," it said, that terrible smile never wavering. "You can join the others now." I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and ran, heading for the highway, but no matter how fast I ran, the exit never seemed to get any closer. It was like running on a treadmill. The world moving around me, but my position never changing. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. But eventually I collapsed, my lungs burning, my legs giving out beneath me. As I lay there on the cold asphalt, gasping for breath, I heard them. Footsteps. Dozens of them coming from all directions. I looked up to see shapes emerging from the darkness. They might have been human once, but not anymore. They moved with that same jerky, wrong gait I'd seen earlier. They surrounded me, their faces, if you could call them faces, all wearing that same too-wide smile. And as they reached for me with hands that had far too many fingers, I realized the truth. I hadn't just stopped at a way station. I'd arrived at my final destination. The last thing I remember is those hands grabbing me, lifting me up. As consciousness faded, I had one last, desperate thought. When you're out on the road, be careful where you stop. Because some places, once you enter, you never leave. And the Millbrook way station, it's always open, always waiting for the next driver to pull in. So if you're driving late at night and you see those signs directing you to pull over and weigh in, do yourself a favor. Keep driving. Don't look back. And whatever you do, don't stop at Millbrook. Because if you do, you might find yourself becoming a permanent part of the night crew. And trust me, in this place, the shifts never end. Story 11. The moment I saw our slashed tire, I knew our pit stop in this quaint little town was about to become a nightmare. My wife Sarah and I had been on the road for hours, driving cross-country to visit her parents in Oregon. It was supposed to be a fun adventure, a chance to see parts of the country we'd never explored before. But as we pulled into this tiny town just off the highway, exhausted and hungry, I had no idea we were about to stumble into something far more sinister than we could have imagined. The sun had already set when we spotted the diner, its neon sign a beacon in the growing darkness. "Lou's Eats," it proclaimed in flickering blue and red. The parking lot was half full, mostly with dusty pickup trucks and a few cars that had seen better days. "What do you think, Jen?" Sarah asked, peering at the diner through the windshield. "It doesn't look too sketchy, right?" I shrugged, my stomach growling loudly enough for both of us to hear. At this point, I'd eat just about anything. Besides, these small-town diners often have the best food. We parked and made our way inside. The bell above the door jingled cheerfully as we entered, a stark contrast to the somber atmosphere that greeted us. The diner was about half full, but eerily quiet. Conversation seemed to die down as we walked in, and I could feel eyes following us as we made our way to an empty booth. A waitress who looked to be in her 60s approached us, her lined face set in a perpetual frown. "What can I get you folks?" she asked, her voice gravelly from years of cigarettes. We ordered burgers and fries, plus a slice of apple pie that the menu proclaimed was famous across 3 counties. As we waited for our food, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The other patrons kept stealing glances at us, quickly looking away when I met their eyes. "Is it just me?" Sarah whispered, leaning across the table. "Or is everyone acting weird?" I was about to respond when I overheard a snippet of conversation from the booth behind us. "Third one this month. Sheriff says they can't find any leads. It's them highway folks, I'm telling you. No one local would do something like that." My curiosity piqued. I strained to hear more, but their voices had dropped too low. I turned back to Sarah, about to share what I'd heard, when our food arrived. The burgers were actually pretty good, juicy and flavorful. As we ate, the atmosphere in the diner seemed to relax a bit. People returned to their conversations, though still in hushed tones. It wasn't until we were halfway through our pie that things took a turn. The bell above the door jingled again and a hush fell over the diner. I looked up to see a man in a sheriff's uniform enter, his face grim. He made his way to the counter where the owner, a portly man with a thick mustache, was wiping down the surface. They spoke in low voices, but in the quiet diner their words carried. "Another one, Lou," the sheriff said, his voice heavy. "Found her car abandoned on Route 7, just like the others." The owner, Lou, I presumed, shook his head. "Jesus, Tom, that's what, 4 now?" "5, the sheriff corrected. "And not a single lead. It's like they're just disappearing into thin air." A chill ran down my spine. Disappearances? Along the highway? Sarah and I exchanged worried glances. Suddenly, our cozy road trip felt a lot less safe. We finished our pie quickly, eager to get back on the road despite our tiredness. As I approached the counter to pay, I could feel the weight of everyone's stares on my back. "Everything all right?" Lou asked as he rang up our bill, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Yeah, fine," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Food was great. We should get going, though. Still have a long drive ahead of us." He nodded slowly, handing me my change. "You folks be careful out there. Highway can be dangerous at night." We hurried out of the diner, the bell's cheerful jingle now seeming almost mocking. As we stepped into the cool night air, Sarah grabbed my arm. "Jen, look," she whispered, pointing at our car. My heart sank. Even in the dim light of the parking lot, I could see that our rear tire was completely flat. "Shit," I muttered, hurrying over to inspect the damage. It didn't take long to spot the problem, a clean slice across the sidewall. This wasn't an accident. Someone had deliberately slashed our tire. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Should we go back inside and ask for help?" I hesitated, looking back at the diner. Through the windows, I could see several patrons watching us, their faces unreadable in the harsh fluorescent light. "I don't think that's a good idea," I said slowly. "Something's not right here. Let's just change the tire ourselves and get out of here as fast as we can." Sarah nodded, her face pale in the moonlight. We got to work, me jacking up the car while Sarah retrieved the spare tire from the trunk. The whole time I could feel eyes on us from the diner. As I was tightening the last lug nut, I heard the diner's door open. Footsteps approached, crunching on the gravel. "Having some trouble?" a voice asked. I looked up to see the sheriff standing a few feet away, his hand resting casually on his holstered gun. "Just a flat," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "We're almost done here." He nodded, looking at our out-of-state license plate. "Long way from home, aren't you? Where are you folks headed?" "Oregon," Sarah replied before I could stop her. "Visiting family." "Oregon, huh?" The sheriff's eyes narrowed slightly. That's quite a drive. You planning on stopping for the night somewhere? No, we're going to push through, I said quickly, standing up and wiping my hands on my jeans. Thanks for your concern, but we really should get going. The sheriff didn't move. You know, it's not safe to drive these roads at night, especially not for out-of-towners. We've had some incidents lately. Maybe you should consider staying in town tonight. We've got a nice little motel just down the road. The way he said it, it didn't sound like a suggestion. I could feel Sarah tensing beside me. Thanks, but we'll be fine, I insisted, moving towards the driver's side door. We've done plenty of night driving before. The sheriff's hand tightened on his gun. I really think you should reconsider, for your own safety. My heart was pounding now. Every instinct was screaming at me to get in the car and drive away as fast as possible. But I knew if I made any sudden moves, things could go very bad very quickly. That's when I heard it. The faint but unmistakable sound of a car engine starting up. From the corner of my eye, I saw headlights flick on in a dark corner of the parking lot. The sheriff turned towards the sound, momentarily distracted. It was all the opening we needed. Now, I yelled to Sarah. We dove into the car, me in the driver's seat, her in the passenger's. I jammed the key into the ignition and turned it, silently praying the engine would start. The car roared to life just as the sheriff turned back towards us, his gun now drawn. Stop! He shouted, but I was already throwing the car into reverse. We peeled out of the parking lot, gravel spraying as I fishtailed onto the main road. In the rearview mirror, I could see the sheriff running towards a patrol car, its lights already flashing. Oh my God, Sarah was saying, her voice high with panic. What's happening? What do we do? Call 911, I said, pushing the car as fast as it would go. Tell them everything, where we are, what happened, everything. As Sarah fumbled with her phone, I saw headlights appear in my rearview mirror. The sheriff was in pursuit and he was gaining on us. For the next hour, we sped through the darkness, the flashing lights of the patrol car always just behind us. Sarah was on the phone with a 911 dispatcher from the next county over, her voice shaking as she explained our situation. Finally, mercifully, we saw more flashing lights ahead. But these were friendly state troopers responding to Sarah's 911 call. As we pulled over, the sheriff's car suddenly veered off, disappearing down a side road. The next few hours were a blur of questions and statements. The state police were horrified by our story, assuring us they would investigate thoroughly. They escorted us to the nearest city where we checked into a hotel, too shaken to continue our journey. As we lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, Sarah turned to me. Do you think we would have been next? If we had stayed? I pulled her close, not wanting to voice the fear that was churning in my gut. I don't know, but I'm glad we didn't find out. We never did hear what came of the investigation. Part of me doesn't want to know, but one thing's for certain. We'll never look at small towns the same way again, and we always check our tires before stopping for the night. Story 12. The moment I picked up that phone, I knew my life would never be the same. What I didn't know was whether I'd live long enough to regret it. My name's Carlos, and I've been a garbage truck worker in this city for the past 5 years. It's not a glamorous job, but it pays the bills and keeps me in shape. Most days blur together in a haze of early mornings, heavy lifting, and the ever-present stench of other people's trash. But this day was different. It started like any other Tuesday. My partner Dave and I were making our usual rounds through the suburbs, the hydraulic whine of the truck's compactor providing a familiar backdrop to our mundane chatter about last night's game. We were about halfway through our route when I spotted it, a sleek smartphone lying atop a pile of garbage bags next to a dented trash can. Now, finding discarded electronics isn't unusual in our line of work. People throw away perfectly good stuff all the time. But something about this phone caught my eye. "Hold up, Dave," I called, hopping down from the truck. "Gonna check something out." I picked up the phone, surprised to find it still had some battery life. The screen lit up, revealing a background image of a smiling couple. No passcode, which was odd for such a new-looking device. "Someone's gonna be missing this," I muttered, pocketing the phone with the intention of turning it in to lost and found later. We continued our route, the incident already fading from my mind as we focused on the task at hand. It wasn't until my lunch break, hours later, that I remembered the phone. Curious, I pulled it out and started scrolling through. That's when things got weird. The most recent text messages were disturbing, to say the least. Cryptic references to a job that needed to be taken care of. Coordinates for what looked like a remote location. And most chilling of all, a photo of a man bound and gagged, terror evident in his eyes. My blood ran cold as the realization hit me. I was holding evidence of a serious crime. I was debating whether to call the police when the phone buzzed in my hand, nearly causing me to drop it. A new message popped up on the screen. "Who are you and how did you get this phone?" My heart racing, I stared at the message, unsure how to respond. Before I could decide, another message came through. "We can see you, blue uniform, sitting in a garbage truck. You have something that doesn't belong to you." Panic seized me. I whipped my head around, scanning the nearly empty street for any sign of whoever was watching me. But there was nothing, just the usual midday quiet of the suburbs. Another buzz. "If you want to live, you'll do exactly as we say. First, destroy your personal phone. Now..." My hands shaking, I pulled out my own phone. Every instinct screamed at me to call for help, to alert someone to what was happening, but the threat felt all too real. With a silent apology to my mom for the missed calls she'd undoubtedly make later, I dropped my phone to the pavement and crushed it under my boot. The mystery phone buzzed again. "Good. Now drive to the following address. Come alone. You have 30 minutes. An address popped up, a location on the outskirts of town. I sat there for a moment, my mind racing. I could run, try to disappear. But whoever these people were, they seemed to have eyes everywhere. And what about the man in the photo? If this was my one chance to help him... "Carlos, break's over, man!" Dave's voice made me jump. He was standing by the truck, giving me an impatient look. I made a split-second decision. "Hey, Dave, I'm not feeling great. Think I ate something bad. Mind if I clock out early?" Dave looked concerned. "You sure you're okay to drive, huh?" I forced a weak smile. Yeah, I'll be fine. Just need to get home." As I drove towards the address, my stomach churned with a mix of fear and anticipation. The city gradually gave way to more rural surroundings, houses becoming fewer and farther between. Finally, I pulled up to a dilapidated barn set back from the road. No other vehicles in sight. Just as I was wondering if I'd made a horrible mistake, the phone buzzed one last time. Inside. Now. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of my car and approached the barn. The door creaked ominously as I pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit interior cluttered with old farm equipment. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Over here," a gruff voice responded from the shadows. I squinted, making out the silhouette of a man seated at a rickety table. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I saw he wasn't alone. 2 other men flanked him, their expressions grim. "Sit," the man at the table commanded, gesturing to an empty chair across from him. I complied, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. "Now then," the man said, leaning forward. "Let's talk about that phone you found." For the next few minutes, I recounted how I'd come across the device, careful to omit any mention of the disturbing messages I'd seen. The man listened impassively, his face betraying no emotion. When I finished, he exchanged glances with his companions before turning back to me. "You've put us in quite a predicament, Carlos. That phone contains sensitive information that could be very dangerous in the wrong hands." "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't want any trouble. I'll give you the phone and forget this ever happened." The man chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. You see, we can't be certain you haven't already shared what you've seen. And in our line of work, uncertainty is problematic." A chill ran down my spine as the implication of his words sank in. "I swear I haven't told anyone," I said, desperation creeping into my voice. "Please, I have a family, a little girl." The man held up a hand, silencing me. "Relax, Carlos, we're not monsters, we're businessmen, and right now you have something we want. The question is, what can you offer us in return for your discretion?" My mind raced. What could I possibly offer these people? Then it hit me, my job, my access. "Information," I blurted out. "I'm a garbage man. You'd be amazed at what people throw away. Bank statements, personal documents, you name it. I could keep an eye out for anything useful." The man's eyebrows raised slightly, a flicker of interest crossing his face. "Go on. And the truck. I continued, the words tumbling out now. It's perfect for transporting things without raising suspicion. Nobody looks twice at a garbage truck. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The man seemed to be weighing his options, his gaze never leaving my face. Finally, he nodded. You might just prove useful after all, Carlos. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to go back to your life, your job, your family. Act like none of this ever happened. But from now on, you work for us. When we need something, you'll know. Fail to deliver and, well, he gestured vaguely. Let's just say it won't end well for you or your loved ones. Relief flooded through me, quickly followed by a wave of guilt. What had I just agreed to? But I knew I had no choice. It was this, or I didn't want to think about the alternative. I understand, I said quietly. Good, the man replied, sliding a burner phone across the table. Keep this with you at all times. And Carlos, remember, we're always watching. As I drove home that evening, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Fear, guilt, relief, all warring for dominance. I'd survived, yes, but at what cost? I was now entangled in something far bigger and more dangerous than I could have imagined. I thought about going to the police, but the threat to my family held me back. These people clearly had resources, influence. How could I be sure they wouldn't make good on their promises if I talked? So I did the only thing I could do. I went home, hugged my daughter extra tight, and tried to act like everything was normal. But as I lay awake that night, my wife sleeping peacefully beside me, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life had irrevocably changed. Every trash can now held potential secrets. Every pickup could be a test. And always there was the weight of that burner phone in my pocket, a constant reminder of the Faustian bargain I'd struck. I'm still a garbage man, but now I'm something else too. A reluctant informant, a man living on borrowed time. And every day I pray that the next piece of trash I pick up won't be the one that seals my fate. Because in this city, even the garbage has secrets, and some secrets are deadlier than others. Story 13. The moment I saw those eyes glowing in the darkness, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. This wasn't a routine traffic stop. This wasn't even a real cop. And now as I sat frozen in my driver's seat, I realized I might not make it home tonight. It had been a long day, and I was eager to get back to my apartment. I'd spent the weekend helping my sister move into her new place a few hours away, and now I was making the late-night drive back to the city. The highway was nearly empty, a black ribbon stretching out before me, illuminated only by my headlights and the occasional glare of passing trucks. I was tired, I'll admit that. My eyes kept drifting to the clock on my dashboard. 1:37 a.m., just another hour or so and I'd be home, I told myself. I cranked up the radio and cracked the window, letting the cool night air help keep me alert. That's when I saw the flashing lights in my rearview mirror. At first I was confused. I hadn't been speeding. If anything, I'd been going under the limit, trying to stay safe on the dark, unfamiliar road. But there was no mistaking those red and blue lights. I sighed, figuring it was just my luck to get pulled over when I was so close to home. I eased onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under my tires as I came to a stop. The patrol car pulled up behind me, its headlights flooding my car with harsh white light. I squinted against the glare, reaching for my wallet to get my license ready. As I waited for the officer to approach, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. Something felt off. The way the patrol car had appeared so suddenly on the empty road. The fact that I couldn't recall passing any places where a cop could have been hiding, waiting to catch speeders. I watched in my side mirror as a figure emerged from the patrol car. The flashing lights created a strobing effect, making it hard to get a clear look. But as the officer drew closer, I felt my heart begin to race. The uniform was wrong. I couldn't put my finger on exactly how, but it didn't look quite right. Too baggy in some places, too tight in others, as if it had been hastily put together rather than professionally tailored. I rolled down my window as the officer approached, plastering what I hoped was a casual smile on my face. "Evening, officer," I said, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears. Was I speeding? The officer didn't respond immediately. At least I assumed it was a he based on the build, simply stood there slightly too far back from my window. I couldn't make out his face in the shadows cast by his hat. "License and registration." he finally said, his voice oddly flat and emotionless. I handed over my documents, trying to get a better look at him as I did so. That's when I noticed the badge, or rather the lack of one. Where a police badge should have been pinned to his chest, there was only a blank space. My mouth went dry. This wasn't right. None of this was right. The officer took my license, holding it up as if examining it, but his movements were jerky, unnatural, like someone mimicking actions they'd seen but never actually performed. "Step out of the vehicle," he said suddenly, taking a step back from my car. "I'm sorry, officer, but may I ask why?" I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "I don't believe I've done anything wrong." He didn't respond. Instead, he reached for something at his hip. I tensed, expecting to see a gun, but what he pulled out was different. In the flashing lights, I caught a glimpse of something that looked more like a cattle prod than any police equipment I'd ever seen. That's when I made my decision. Whatever was happening here, I knew I couldn't stay in this car. I had to run. I threw my door open, catching the knot officer off guard. As I burst out of the car, I finally got a clear look at his face. What I saw made me stumble, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. His eyes. They weren't human eyes at all. They were large, almost insectoid, and they reflected the flashing lights like a cat's eyes would. For a moment, we just stared at each other, both equally surprised. Then he lunged for me. I don't remember consciously deciding to run. One moment I was frozen in shock, the next I was sprinting down the highway, my feet pounding against the asphalt. I could hear him behind me, a strange scuttling sound that was definitely not the footsteps of a human in pursuit. The highway stretched out before me, dark and empty. I had no idea where I was going, only that I had to get away. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror kept me moving. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The thing chasing me had abandoned all pretense of humanity. Its uniform hung in tatters, revealing a body that was decidedly not human underneath. It moved on all fours, covering ground at an alarming rate. I pushed myself harder, knowing that if that thing caught me, it would be over. But I was tiring, and it showed no signs of slowing down. Just when I thought I couldn't run another step, I saw something ahead. Lights. A gas station. Its fluorescent glow a beacon of hope in the darkness. With a final burst of energy I didn't know I had, I sprinted for the station. As I got closer, I could make out a figure behind the counter inside. Safety. Witnesses. A phone to call for help. I burst through the door, the bell above it jingling cheerfully, completely at odds with the terror coursing through me. The clerk looked up, startled by my sudden entrance. "Please," I gasped, struggling to catch my breath. "Call the police. There's something chasing me." The clerk's eyes widened, looking past me to the door. I spun around, dreading what I might see, but there was nothing there. The parking lot was empty, the highway beyond dark and still. I turned back to the clerk, who was eyeing me warily. "I swear there was something out there," I said, my voice shaking. It looked like a cop at first, but then I trailed off, realizing how insane I must sound. The clerk's hand was hovering near the phone, and I got the distinct impression he was debating whether to call the police on me. "Look," I said, trying to calm myself down. "I know how this sounds, but I'm telling you, something strange is going on out there. Can I use your phone, please?" After a moment's hesitation, the clerk nodded, pushing the store's cordless phone towards me. With shaking hands, I dialed 911. As I waited for someone to pick up, I kept my eyes fixed on the door, half expecting to see those glowing eyes appear at any moment. But nothing happened. The highway remained quiet, the night undisturbed. When the 911 operator answered, I found myself struggling to explain what had happened. How could I describe something I didn't understand myself? In the harsh fluorescent light of the gas station, with a skeptical clerk watching me, the whole experience seemed increasingly unreal. In the end, I simply reported an attempted assault by someone impersonating a police officer. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was as close as I could get without sounding completely unhinged. The real police arrived about 20 minutes later. By then, I had almost convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe I had been more tired than I realized. Maybe it was just a regular cop and my exhausted mind had blown things out of proportion. But as I described the events to the officers, I saw them exchange a look. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it was there. "You're not the first person to report something like this in this area," one of them said finally. "We've had a few unusual incidents over the past month." A chill ran down my spine at his words. So I wasn't crazy. Something was really happening out here. The officers took my statement and offered to escort me home. As we drove back down the highway, I kept a vigilant watch out the window, half expecting to see those glowing eyes watching from the darkness. We never found my car. According to the officers, there was no sign of it where I said I'd been pulled over. No sign of the fake patrol car either. It was as if the whole incident had been wiped from existence, leaving behind nothing but my terrified memories. I made it home safely that night, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that not quite human face, those glowing eyes. And I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there on some dark, lonely stretch of highway, it was still waiting, watching, ready to pull over the next unsuspecting driver. So if you're ever driving late at night and you see those flashing lights in your rearview mirror, take a good look before you pull over. And if something doesn't feel right, if the officer approaching your car doesn't seem quite human, don't stop. Don't ever stop. Because some things out there are wearing uniforms, but they're not here to protect and serve. They're here to hunt. And once they've got you in their sights, there's no telling where that traffic stop might end. Story 14. The moment my radio crackled and died, I knew this wasn't going to be just another abandoned vehicle call. Little did I know it would be the night that would haunt me for years to come. My name is Officer Elena Ramirez, and I've been with the Highway Patrol for 6 years. I've seen my fair share of weird stuff out on these lonely stretches of road, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. It was a Tuesday in late October, just past midnight. The air had that crisp autumn chill that makes you grateful for a warm jacket and a thermos of coffee. I was cruising down Highway 16, a notoriously desolate stretch of road that winds through miles of dense forest. The kind of place where your headlights seem to get swallowed up by the darkness. The call came in around 12:30 a.m. Dispatch reported an abandoned vehicle on the shoulder near mile marker 67. Normally, I'd be annoyed at having to deal with a breakdown this late, but tonight I was almost grateful for something to break up the monotony. As I approached mile marker 67, I saw it, a beat-up old Ford Taurus, its hazard lights blinking weakly in the gloom. I pulled up behind it, flicking on my light bar to alert any oncoming traffic. Not that there was likely to be any out here at this hour. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the cruiser. The moment my boots hit the asphalt, something felt off. The air seemed too still, the silence too complete. Even the usual nighttime sounds of the forest were absent. "Dispatch, this is Officer Ramirez. I'm on scene with the abandoned vehicle," I said into my radio as I approached the car. Static was my only response. I frowned, tapping the radio. "Dispatch, do you copy E? More static." "Great. Radio dead zones weren't uncommon out here, but it still made me uneasy." Shaking off the feeling, I approached the Taurus. The driver's side door was slightly ajar, but there was no sign of the driver. I shined my flashlight through the windows, seeing nothing but an empty fast food bag on the passenger seat. That's when I noticed the markings on the ground. At first, I thought they were just skid marks from the car pulling over suddenly. But as I looked closer, I realized they were something else entirely. Strange symbols etched into the asphalt as if burned there. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the October air. What the hell was I looking at? I was so focused on the markings that I almost missed the sound. A whisper so faint I thought I might have imagined it, but then it came again, louder this time, seeming to come from the woods on the other side of the highway. "Hello?" I called out, my hand instinctively moving to rest on my holstered weapon. "This is Highway Patrol. Is anyone there?" The whispers grew louder, but I couldn't make out any words. It was like listening to a conversation underwater, and it wasn't coming from any one direction. It seemed to be all around me. I should have called for backup. Should have gotten in my cruiser and hightailed it out of there until I could get in touch with dispatch. But curiosity has always been my weakness. And something about those whispers, they seemed almost familiar. I took a step towards the tree line, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "If anyone's out there, I'm here to help. Please identify yourself." The whispers suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and then movement. Just at the edge of my flashlight's beam, a figure darting between the trees. "Stop! Police!" I shouted, drawing my weapon. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew something was wrong. The way the figure moved, it wasn't natural, too fluid, too fast. I gave chase, plunging into the woods. Branches whipped at my face as I ran, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. I could hear the figure ahead of me, moving impossibly quickly through the underbrush. Suddenly, I burst into a small clearing, and there in the center was nothing. The figure had vanished, but the clearing wasn't empty. In the center was a perfect circle of those strange symbols I'd seen on the road, burned into the grass, and scattered around it were objects. A child's teddy bear, a man's wallet, a woman's shoe, all arranged in a pattern I couldn't comprehend. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. This was wrong. All of it was wrong. I needed to get out of here, to call for backup, to... A twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, my gun raised, finger on the trigger, and came face to face with myself. It was like looking in a mirror, but wrong. The face was mine, but the eyes were pitch black, emotionless. It smiled at me, a grotesque parody of my own smile. I stumbled backward, a scream caught in my throat. This couldn't be real. It had to be a dream, a hallucination, anything but real. The thing that wore my face took a step forward. When it spoke, it was with my voice, but distorted, as if coming from the bottom of a well. "We've been waiting for you, Elena," it said. "For so long." I fired. The gunshot was deafening in the quiet of the clearing. The thing stumbled backward, a look of surprise crossing its face. For a moment I thought I'd won. But then it straightened up, and where I'd shot it, the wound wasn't bleeding. Instead, it was unraveling, like a sweater coming apart at the seams. And behind the unraveling skin was nothing but darkness. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. Branches tore at my uniform. Roots seemed to reach up to trip me, but I didn't stop. I could hear it behind me, moving through the woods with inhuman speed. I burst out of the tree line, gasping for air. My cruiser was still there, its lights cutting through the darkness. I threw myself inside, fumbling with the keys. As the engine roared to life, I looked in the rearview mirror, and there it was, standing at the edge of the woods, still wearing my face, still smiling that terrible smile. I floored it, tires squealing on the asphalt. I didn't slow down until I was miles away, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel straight. When I finally pulled over, the first rays of dawn were starting to peek over the horizon. My radio crackled to life, dispatch asking where I'd been all night. I didn't know how to answer. How could I explain what I'd seen? Who would believe me? In the end, I reported the abandoned vehicle, said I'd had radio trouble and had to leave to find a signal. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't exactly a lie either. I've been back to that stretch of highway many times since that night. The abandoned Taurus was gone by the next day, with no record of it ever being there. The symbols on the road had vanished too, leaving no trace. Sometimes, late at night when I'm patrolling that area, I think I hear whispers in the woods. And sometimes, just for a moment, I catch a glimpse of a figure that looks just like me, standing at the edge of the trees. But I don't stop anymore. I don't investigate. Some mysteries, I've learned, are better left unsolved, and some nights on Highway 16 are better left forgotten. But I know one thing for certain. I'll never look at an abandoned vehicle called the same way again. And I always make sure my radio is working before I step out of my cruiser. Because out here in the darkness, when you're alone with whatever lurks in the woods, your radio might be the only thing standing between you and the unknown. And trust me, there are some things out there that are better left undiscovered. Story 15. The night air crackled with an electric tension as I pulled up to the crash site. Twisted metal glinted in my headlights and an eerie silence blanketed the scene. In my 5 years as a tow truck driver, I'd seen my share of wrecks, but something about this one made my skin crawl. Little did I know I was about to stumble into a web of deceit that would turn my quiet life upside down. The name's Mike Callahan, and this is the night that changed everything. It was just past 2 a.m. when the call came in. Multiple vehicle pileup on Highway 16 about 20 miles outside of town. As the closest available driver, it fell to me to head out there and start clearing the mess. The fog was thick as soup as I made my way down the winding road, my wipers struggling to keep the windshield clear. The radio crackled with updates, at least 5 vehicles involved, possible fatalities. Emergency services were en route, but in this weather it would take them a while to arrive. I spotted the wreckage before I saw the flares. 3 cars and what looked like a small delivery truck all tangled together in a brutal dance of metal and glass. Smoke still rose from one of the vehicles, and the acrid smell of burnt rubber filled the air. Pulling over to the shoulder, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the foggy night. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional groan of settling metal. "Hello," I called out, sweeping my light across the scene. Anyone here? Emergency services are on their way." No response. As I approached the nearest car, a red sedan crumpled like an accordion. A chill ran down my spine. The driver's side door hung open, but there was no one inside. No blood, no signs of injury, just an empty seat and an airbag that never deployed. Moving to the next vehicle, a blue SUV on its side, I found the same thing. Door open, no driver, no passengers, no personal belongings scattered around as you'd expect in a crash this violent. My heart began to race. This wasn't right. In a pileup this bad, there should be injuries, panicked survivors, something. But it was as if everyone had simply vanished into the fog. I was about to check the third car when a sound caught my attention. A faint groan coming from the direction of the delivery truck. Hope surged through me. Finally, a survivor. I rushed over, my flashlight beam cutting through the mist. The truck had taken the brunt of the impact, its cab crushed and twisted. But there, in the passenger seat, was a man, alive but barely conscious. "Hey, buddy, can you hear me?" I called out, trying to find a way to reach him through the mangled wreckage. "Help's on the way, just hang in there." The man's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and filled with pain. He mumbled something I couldn't make out. "What's that?" I asked, leaning closer. "What happened here?" His hand shot out suddenly, gripping my arm with surprising strength. His eyes locked onto mine, suddenly clear and intent. "Not what it seems," he gasped. "They're coming, you have to." But whatever he was about to say was cut off by a fit of coughing. When it subsided, he slumped back, unconscious once more. My mind reeled. What the hell did he mean, not what it seems? And who was coming? The sound of approaching sirens snapped me back to reality. I turned to see the flashing lights of police cars and ambulances cutting through the fog. Relief washed over me. The professionals were here. They'd sort this out. As the first police car pulled up, I jogged over to meet them. A young officer, couldn't have been more than 25, stepped out. "Officer," I called out, "thank God you're here. We've got a real mess on our hands." The cop nodded, his face grim. "What's the situation?" I quickly filled him in on what I'd found, the empty vehicles, the injured man in the truck, but as I spoke, I noticed something odd. The officer wasn't taking notes, wasn't radioing anything in. He just stood there, listening with an unnerving intensity. "And the man in the truck," the cop said, his voice oddly flat. "What exactly did he say to you?" A flicker of unease stirred in my gut. Why was that his primary concern? "Not much," I replied cautiously. He was pretty out of it. Mentioned something about "they're coming," but I don't know what he meant. The officer's hand moved to rest on his holstered weapon. "I see. And you didn't notice anything unusual about the crash site?" Warning bells started going off in my head. This wasn't right. None of this was right. "Look," I said, taking a step back. "I've told you everything I know. Maybe we should focus on getting that guy out of the truck." The cop's expression hardened. "I'm afraid I'm going to need you to come with me, sir. We have some questions about what you've witnessed here tonight." That's when I knew I was in trouble. Deep trouble. Without thinking, I turned and ran. I heard the officer shout behind me, but I didn't look back. I plunged into the fog, my heart pounding in my ears. I don't know how long I ran, stumbling through the misty darkness. Eventually, I found myself in a dense patch of woods off the highway. Gasping for breath, I leaned against a tree, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The crash, the missing drivers, the cryptic warning from the injured man, none of it added up. And that cop, he wasn't there to help. He was looking for something, or someone. As my breathing slowed, I realized the gravity of my situation. I'd fled from a police officer at an accident scene. Even if this was all some big misunderstanding, I was in serious legal trouble now. But deep down, I knew this was more than a misunderstanding. I'd stumbled onto something big, something dangerous, and now I was a loose end. I pulled out my phone, relieved to see I still had signal. But who could I call? The police were clearly not an option. My wife? No, I couldn't drag her into this. I needed someone who would believe me, someone who could help me make sense of this mess. Then it hit me. Janet, my ex-partner from my brief stint as a private investigator years ago. If anyone could help me unravel this mystery, it was her. With shaking fingers, I dialed her number, praying she'd pick up at this ungodly hour. Mike. Her groggy voice was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. Do you have any idea what time it is? Janet, listen to me, I said, trying to keep my voice low. I'm in trouble, big trouble. I need your help. There must have been something in my tone that conveyed the seriousness of the situation. I heard rustling on her end as she sat up. What's going on, Mike? I took a deep breath and told her everything. The crash, the missing drivers, the injured man's warning, and my encounter with the suspicious cop. There was a long pause when I finished. For a moment, I feared she'd hang up, dismiss me as crazy. Okay, she finally said, her voice now fully alert. First things first. Are you safe right now? I glanced around the dark woods. I think so, for now. Good. Stay where you are. I'm coming to get you. And Mike, don't trust anyone else. Understand? Relief flooded through me. Yeah, I understand. Thanks, Janet. I owe you one. You owe me several, she replied, a hint of her old humor creeping in. Just sit tight. I'll be there as soon as I can. As I ended the call, a twig snapped somewhere in the darkness. I froze, straining my ears. It could have been an animal, but I wasn't taking any chances. I needed to move. Keeping low, I crept through the underbrush, trying to put some distance between myself and the highway. My mind raced with questions. What had I stumbled into? Who were they, and what were they coming for? And most pressingly, how was I going to get out of this alive? One thing was clear, my life as I knew it was over. From this moment on, I was a man on the run, caught up in a conspiracy I didn't understand. But I was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I found a secluded spot to wait for Janet. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Whatever was going on, whatever forces were at play, I was now irrevocably involved. The quiet night that had started with a routine tow truck call had turned into the first chapter of a dangerous adventure. And as I sat there, hidden in the woods, I realized that the real journey was just beginning. Little did I know the secrets I would uncover in the coming days would shake the very foundations of our town and put everyone I cared about in grave danger. But that's a story for another time. For now, all I could do was wait and hope that Janet would arrive before they, whoever they were, found me first.